All right, so ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, it's a pleasure to be here to have this opportunity to speak about globalization. Now, I thought that to get the ball rolling, I would start with a Shakespeare quote, which is that the sickness doth infect the very lifeblood of our enterprise. It's from Henry IV. And I think it's a good description of what's going on nowadays because as everyone the world over has been suffering from the impact of the COVID crisis, the pandemic, the economic downturn that has been created by the lockdowns around the world, um, clearly businesses are not doing well. And before the pandemic, and some might argue partially due to globalization, um, well, let me rephrase that. Before the pandemic, we had a lot of globalization, and some blame globalization for the pandemic because if there hadn't been as much international travel, if the borders in many countries hadn't been as open, if people couldn't travel as freely, then perhaps the disease would not have spread as quickly as it did and would not be this unstoppable or nearly unstoppable force that it is. And I think as a result, globalization has lost some of its shine and luster. A lot of people tend to see globalization rather skeptically now. And there's really a pendulum motion with globalization that's been going on for several centuries. The original founding of The Economist, the magazine, was very much to argue in favor of more liberalization of trade, specifically, I think, against uh, barriers to wheat tariffs. So specifically against wheat tariffs, which would create trade barriers in the United Kingdom, and and the U.S. trade policy has also constantly shifted between more protectionism on the one hand and more liberalization on the other. Um, and so the fact is that as someone that makes a living off of international trade and business, maybe not directly, but certainly because there wouldn't be a need for interpreters if there were no international relations, and international relations are ultimately founded on international trade. Uh, the fact is that I am a proponent of globalization, and not just because I want to travel outside of Belgium again, but that is part of it. Um, I think there's an open microphone, Amy. I think your microphone is on. Just saying. In any case, so back to the topic at hand. Thank you. Um, because of my particular background, being Canadian, I'm going to speak about one of the trade agreements that I'm most familiar with, and then expand to the way in which globalization has affected North America, and then how it's perceived, and how it can perhaps actually be an instrument for progress and for greater fairness in people's lives. It's not exactly the way most people envision globalization. You typically think, well, globalization is good for the wealthy, and it's bad for workers. It's bad for mom and pop shops. It's bad for the little guy or the little girl. But actually, when you look at figures, the reason economists back liberalization, removing trade barriers, broadly speaking, globalization, is because it does have many benefits, economic benefits, but also benefits for peace, because greater trade generally leads to greater peace. The European Union is an excellent example of that. You have in the European Union the world's largest free trade area, and the reason that it was founded, as most of you know, was in large part to avoid yet another world war, because two already brought the continent to its knees, and it really couldn't support or survive probably any more such vast conflicts. And the only way to get people talking and negotiating and really living side by side is by creating all these bonds between them. So I'm going to shift gears. As I said, I was going to speak about NAFTA. So that's the North American Free Trade Agreement. Now, NAFTA is something that I grew up with. It was something that was negotiated when I was a teenager, and that came into force shortly thereafter. And it was really sold as more exports, which means more jobs. In Canada, especially in Ontario, where I'm from, we have a sizable automotive industry, and the car making industry represents a significant portion of the province's GDP. And also many of the jobs in the province depend directly or indirectly on the automotive sector, either because uh, people are working in assembly plants or because they work for auto parts makers. Um, and that always has a knock-on effect on the rest of the economy. When there's a downturn and the automotive industry is doing badly, then clearly it's going to have an effect on the entire provincial and federal economy. Uh, Now, you might think that countries that are as close, not just geographically, but also politically, as Canada and the United States, wouldn't have trouble with trade barriers, but that's untrue. In fact, there are a lot of trade barriers between the two. There have been disputes that have gone either to some sort of arbitration through NAFTA or sometimes even to the World Trade Organization on things like lumber, so softwood lumber, on milk exports, on grain crop exports, and many others. And so while it's true that Canada and the United States are commercially very closely allied, it's not always a happy pairing. And the fact is that before NAFTA, and broadly speaking, if you look at the Western world for the last several decades, globalization has been sold to us as something that was going to benefit everyone because it was going to allow for all sorts of things to flow freely across borders. It would allow goods and services and capital to have free access to various markets, and that would be beneficial for everyone. Um, the reality, though, is that often contemporary globalization has been focused mostly on foreign investment and trade. Uh, the globalized economy that we live in has been broadly shaped by major trade agreements. And I mentioned one, NAFTA, but there are a number of others. Another one that was recently in the news was the Transatlantic Trade Agreement, the TTIP. Another one was the TPP, that's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the United States is currently not a member of, but which it is considering trying to rejoin, or rather join. And then many others. And as I said, the European Union in some ways also started as a large free market, and so a trade agreement of sorts. The fact is, though, that one of the advantages, but also one of the drawbacks to having globalization is that in order to be able to have a global economy, we need lower barriers to trade and also harmonized standards. We need to have some sort of common language that we all speak, and I'm not talking about English. I'm talking about industrially. I'm talking about having common standards for quality, common standards for labor rights, and things like that. And that's really where you get the granularity about globalization and where you find ways of improving the lot of the average person. Corporations seek to make profits, investors do as well, workers seek to get by and make a living and hopefully do so in a decent way. And consumers, of course, look to get access to more better quality goods and at a lower price if possible. Now, in the United States, this view is what spurred negotiations on the North American Free Trade Agreement. It was said that it would supercharge growth and it would create jobs, and it would also strengthen the standing specifically of the United States as the world's largest and most important economy. At the time, the President of the United States, George Herbert Walker Bush, said that NAFTA meant more exports and more exports meant more American jobs. Now, about 25 years have passed since then, and since NAFTA initially came into force, and that optimism has eroded away. NAFTA and other trade agreements actually did boost growth, if you look at the figures, and free trade remains overall beneficial to the US economy as a whole. But clearly, the overall gains have been far less dramatic than what was promised. As well, many American workers have suffered when well-paid manufacturing jobs dried up because factories were moved abroad. Those who did manage to stay employed saw their wages stagnate. And in the meantime, the US federal government did very little to create a safety net to help those who were falling through the cracks. And so unsurprisingly, as I said, Americans have complicated views on trade. A majority of voters see free trade as a good thing, but barely 1/3 of voters believe that free trade will create jobs or lower prices. And as a result, we're seeing political trends, especially from the Republican Party, but also from the further left wing of the Democratic Party, which tend to pick up on this general sense within the electorate that globalization is bad and apply that in their policymaking. The Biden administration, on the other hand, is cautiously for free trade, I would say. They have made some relatively noble sounding statements or commitments to pursue trade policy that is worker centric. Now the specifics are not yet clear. We haven't really seen the exact trade policy that the Biden administration intends to apply, but this sort of approach is likely going to include some hallmarks of the trade policy under President Trump, things like aggressive so-called Buy American provisions in trade agreements, as well as other aspects. Buy American provisions, in case you're not familiar with them, though they're pretty self-descriptive, require government agencies to prefer products made in the United States when making their purchases. And as you know, government purchases account for a large chunk of the economy. That's the case in the United States, it's the case in France, it's the case in many Western countries. There will also be more pressure on trading partners to be more respectful of workers' rights, and in particular collective bargaining rights. And the Biden administration is likely to carry on with a hawkish relationship with China. So it's still going to be tough on China. Now, despite the rhetoric, the proposals the administration has made are really nothing new. They really fall very much in line with standard trade policy for the last 20 years or so. They're just making a few tweaks here and there. And unfortunately, as far as I'm concerned, that approach by the Biden administration is not likely to fix the problems that free trade has caused. Because despite the appeal of protectionists, free trade is not going to disappear. Most likely it's going to carry on and get stronger. And there are a number of reasons which I've already referred to, such as the fact that it is in fact broadly beneficial, that are in play. So the Biden administration, given that it's at the helm of what is still the world's premier economy, should actually establish targeted programs domestically that would protect workers from the downsides of globalization. And I say that because, and I tend to focus on the United States, not only because as a Canadian, I'm an avid US watcher. We get a lot of US news, we follow what's going on politically in the United States, but also because as the world's largest economy, what happens in the United States is often mirrored in other Western nations. And so if the US can get something right, there's a much better chance that it's going to be done properly elsewhere as well. Now, I talked about the US having setting up programs to protect workers from the downsides of globalization. I think it would also be important for the American administration to have a responsible policy that would try to capture the gains of free trade, but also make up for domestic losses. And for the last few years, the United States hasn't done either of these things. Now, the skepticism about globalization that you find in US politics today really can be traced back to the failed promises of trade liberalization in the 1990s. I spoke about NAFTA, but that was only one of two major turning points when it came to trade liberalization during that decade. The other was China's accession to the World Trade Organization. Those two things heavily disrupted economic life in many small and medium-sized American cities. There was a time when these small and medium-sized American cities formed the country's manufacturing backbone. They accounted for a tremendous number of jobs and a lot of wealth generation. Resentment over the changes that the economy went through because of these two major events led ultimately to Donald Trump being elected to the presidency in 2016, because it was very much people in the what's called the Rust Belt, basically the manufacturing heartland of the United States, that heavily voted for Donald Trump, whereas before they might have been much more favorable to Democratic candidates. So if President Biden hopes to either launch or modernize US trade policy, he's going to have to address this legacy. NAFTA, to go back to that, was originally a bipartisan effort. It was launched in 1990 by President Bush Sr. and concluded 4 years later by his successor, Bill Clinton. Leaders in Canada, Mexico, and the United States heralded the deal as an economic miracle. The president of Mexico at the time, Carlos Salinas de Gortari, and his aides promised that the agreement would turn Mexico into the next South Korea. Bill Clinton waxed poetic, not only about conventional economic gains that would come from trade, but also about how NAFTA would foster more equality, better preservation of the environment, and a greater possibility for world peace. Now, clearly, these were fairly bold statements, but they were also quite irresponsible. In the end, NAFTA did what standard economic models predicted. It delivered modest net benefits, primarily by giving US companies access to manufacturing components at lower prices. That made these US companies more competitive on global markets. But NAFTA didn't create any miracles. Although the trade agreement did hasten the industrialization of northern Mexico, the south of Mexico remained quite poor. Productivity growth didn't really improve much, and Mexican immigration to the United States actually surged to new highs during the late 1990s as well as in the early 2000s. That was completely contrary to either Bill Clinton or Carlos Salinas' promises. In the United States, the overall gains in real income from NAFTA were positive, but they were meager. They were less than 0.1%, according to some estimates. Mexico's economy, which was roughly the size of the state of Ohio's at the time that NAFTA was signed, simply was not large enough for the agreement to have a significant impact. There was no enormous shift in the economy, but many US workers, especially those in labor-intensive manufacturing industries, did end up losing their jobs. Some eventually found employment elsewhere, for instance, in new truck or jet engine factories, but most did not. For those workers, the upsides that NAFTA presented to others was not helpful. They were out of jobs. But actually, as I said, freer trade in North America was just the warm-up act for the real show. China's emergence as a global economic powerhouse, which was a process that began in the late 1970s under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, who reduced the stranglehold of the state on the economy, really began to be very visible in the 1990s. In a very short period of time, China became the world's factory. Between 1990 and 2015, China's share of global manufacturing exports rose from 2.8% to 18.5%. You can imagine what a shock that has caused to the global economy, which has had to restructure. And what we're seeing today, in fact, with supply chains and all sorts of supply chain related issues, suddenly with Corona, is directly linked to China becoming the world's factory. If China hadn't been the world's factory for these last 15 to 25 years, we would have had far less issues producing a lot of the things that we needed, the personal protective equipment, for instance, that was needed when the Corona pandemic unfolded. Now, there's a lot more to say about what I could call the China shock on the US economy and on manufacturing jobs. But I think I'm starting to run out of time, so I'm going to have to wrap up. In closing, I want to say that I've been able to present a lot of the causes for skepticism about globalization, but I have yet to have a chance to speak about the positive aspects. And I want to reassure you that despite the impression you may have from this part of my presentation, there are in fact many positive aspects which ultimately tend to outweigh the negatives. But for that to happen, we have to have responsible, active governments who don't simply allow laissez-faire economics to run rampant, but play the part that is given to them in liberal economics, which is to regulate and to help workers and employees maintain good working conditions, good salaries, and also retrain and change careers when that is necessary. Thank you very much.